This is Radio Ecoshock, and we're here with Dr. Peter Ward from the University of Washington. We're talking about his new book, The Flooded Earth, and just the general events of climate around the world. Peter, the new book seems a bit of a change for you. I know that you've been an expert diver, you've looked under the sea, you've poked around on land, working away at different ridges to see what the deep past can tell us. But now you're dealing with the cryosphere, the ice world. Why did you make that change?
Well, a couple of reasons. My deep past work, I was trained as a paleontologist in Canada. I went to McMaster University in Hamilton, has always been really looking at deep time. But over the last 3 years, that deep time has sent me down to Antarctica. And you just, unless you're really truly blind, you can't sit in Antarctica and watch it melting away as all that water makes its way from the land frozen to the ocean wet, and not really understand that there's major changes taking place. I was able to see down in one of the Antarctic bases photographs of 50 years ago where the glaciers were around this particular base on the Antarctic Peninsula, and every one of them has receded, as we know is taking place elsewhere in the planet. But secondly, there's something that deep time gives you the perspective of. Our problem, and we began this interview saying 1 year does not make a trend. But with deep time, you have all the years you ever want. We can go back 500 million years and look at the rock record for the last 500 million years. We have really good indicators of what the climate was like in deep time. Was it warm? Was it cold? Okay, in the warm climate times, how much ice was there on the planet? Well, 0 to none. And what was the carbon dioxide levels during warm times versus cold times? So deep times lets us understand there's no relationship between the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the temperature of the planet. We can get rid of that one because we have lots of people say, oh no, it's solar cycles and this and that. No, we really can see this one-to-one correspondence. Carbon dioxide goes up, global temperatures go up. We can go back 55 million years ago. Carbon dioxide was about 1,000 parts per million. Now it's 300 and almost 390. But back then, 1,000 parts per million, Canada was a lush tropical jungle all the way up to the Arctic Circle because we have crocodiles and alligators in the far northern reaches of Canada 55 billion years ago. High CO2. Well, let's go back, way back. Let's go back to the Permian. Carbon dioxide dropped way below levels to what it was now. We had a 40 to 50 million year long glaciation. Down went CO2, up went the ice. And it just drives me crazy when we have senators in Oklahoma who discount this so simple relationship that deep time tells us. So certainly there's that deep time sense of things that got me into thinking about sea level change. We see it all the time in the rock record. You can watch on a sedimentary outcrop. You walk as you go higher or lower, you can see that the sea level has gone up or gone down. Why not bring that to the modern day? So that was the impetus of this particular book.
And the sea level is so fundamental to our way of thinking. We think of it as a fairly fixed thing. All our docks are at a certain level. Our maps show so many feet above sea level. We're going to have to rewrite the geography of the world if this happens.
Well, little bit by little bit we will, but the greater worry right now is going to be rewriting the economic history of the world. We have just seen in the U.S. over these past 3 or 4 years this enormous depression, really. They call it a recession that was based on bankers being greedy. And one segment of the economy, housing, drove us into what is essentially a global slowdown. Well, what happens when we have to spend enormous quantities of money to change infrastructure? Not just one country, but every country. And let's look at something as simple as the height of a wharf or a pier. Sea level goes up. And global commerce deals mainly from country to country. Railroads, and many of these are right at sea level. Highways, many right at sea level. And shipping. And the ports themselves are predicated on sea level is not going to change. Well, some places where I live, there's what we call mesotidal. There's pretty high sea level changes just every day from the tides, 3 meters perhaps. But some places have no sea level change through tides every day. Well, look, global sea level is going to mean that every place is going to rise. If you have built a pier for a specific sea level, and that sea level changes by 1 meter or 2 meters, in many cases that pier is not going to work anymore. You're going to have to rebuild that thing. Last year, CNN it suggested, or at least thought that by going through a series of economic models, they came up with several $1 trillion just to change pier height if it goes up as little as a half a meter around the world, trillions of dollars. We've got so much infrastructure based on this sense that sea level will never change.
And I'm trying to imagine the possibility of drowned cities, and I think of the city of Alexandria, which now you can see museum tours of what they brought up of the temples and the statues from under the Mediterranean Sea. Now, I know that was caused by subsidence, the sinking of the coastline, and it was caused by tsunamis from the earthquakes that happened over the 2,300 years since Alexander the Great founded that city. But 2,300 years from now, are you predicting we'll be, or someone may be, finding the remains of New York City or other great cities of the world?
Well, it really depends on if there is a critical tipping point or not. And once again, the temperatures of planets, we're doing a vast experiment, and we do not know what the answer is. I mean, it may very well be that ice is pretty impervious, that it will take thousands of years for the ice to melt sufficiently to cause the flooding of cities. I mean, if it does melt, it's going to go up 80 meters, and then you could say, kiss goodbye all the coastal cities. But maybe it's 80 meters over thousands of years. But if we go back to the time of the highest sea level rise, the last glaciation, there was a lot more ice. And that ice melted from these vast ice ages that we've just come out of. We saw 5 meters per century, 15 feet in 100 years. That was enough to completely flood out a lot of coastal cities. And one of the most poignant, I think, was in the Black Sea. Divers have found a whole series of villages, and off Israel as well now, another series of villages that seem to have been flooded out by this really rapid rise, probably about 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. The most rapid of the rise of sea levels, 15 feet in a century, is just, imagine Vancouver or Halifax or any of these cities that in 100 years you've got 5 meters sea level change. You're talking about wholesale calamity from an infrastructure point of view.
And that's happening at a time when many of us believe that we've reached peak oil, that our fossil fuel resources are going to be used up, and we're barely coping, as you say, right now, economically. It feels like a depression to me also. So where are we going to come up with the resources to make these grand plans for adaptation, I wonder?
Well, I don't think there will be, in the sense that I think cities will just keep migrating upward and inward. The sad part will be the great fight over the great art treasures. Remember when we had these dams along the Nile, and there were enormous Egyptian art treasures that were going to be flooded. And the same in China, there was a whole series of archaeological areas that were to be flooded. Pretty soon you just have to give up on some of this most beautiful of all of human architecture. You're just going to say, look, it becomes triage. This city can be saved, this city can't. Dealing with economics, we can already look at the Dutch. The Dutch right now are spending vast sums of money on not just dikes. I mean, dikes is the simplistic way to look at it. It's far more complicated than that now. You put out sand dunes of great size. You have a whole series of river barriers, because it's not just the ocean going up. It's also the interaction of oceans and rivers where they meet them. This is a huge, important area for flooding as well. But when we start spending so much money on infrastructure to save a city, there's going to become a point where sooner or later you say, all right, no more good money after bad. We just can't afford it. We can't afford it. Goodbye city. And I think Miami in North America is Galveston. That one's going to certainly be gone. Even with minor sea level change, those areas just cannot support any rise of sea level at all.
And in your book, The Flooded Earth, Peter Ward, you talk about the San Francisco and the Sacramento Valley areas. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, we know that at least in the United States, the greatest single agricultural region for productivity is the Great Valleys of California, the San Joaquin Valley to the south of Sacramento and the Sacramento Valley to the north. These are enormous, extremely richly productive agricultural regions. I don't know the percentage, but a gigantic amount of North America's vegetables come out of this San Joaquin Valley and then further south into some of the troughs, the Imperial Valley. Fruit, vegetables, we also have grasslands, enormous amount of livestock. These areas are vastly threatened not by the rise of the sea, but by the rise of salinity in the soil. Rising sea level is one problem, but when you have an ocean going up, it also goes laterally. As we know, if you have dry soil and just put some water on it, it diffuses through. Well, it actually diffuses through sideways very, very easily. And anytime you have salt water hitting agricultural soil, that diffusion sideways is our greatest problem. This is the greatest threat affecting Bangladesh, in fact. It's not so much that sea level rise is going to cover up a lot of their property, which it will. It is that the areas that the sea doesn't yet touch will still be ruined for agriculture. Bangladesh is a place where agriculture feeds its populace right now, but barely. But as their numbers rise, which they will in the next 50 years, and as sea level rises in the next 50 years, more and more salt is going into areas they cannot afford to lose. So this is, as I say, the single greatest threat. It is human starvation based on salinization of low-lying crop areas.
What is the range of sea level rise expected in this century by various scientific authorities?
Well, the ICPP, this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or Climate Program, I can never get it right, but this is the big one. This is the multi-scientist organization that's every country has put people in. They've suggested in their last assessment that we might see, at most 59 centimeters, but they're thinking probably about 30 to 40 to 50 centimeters, somewhere in there, a half meter as the maximum problem by 2100. Now, this was put together in 2007 by a committee. And we all have seen committees at work, but not just that, it's put together by a committee of scientists, none of whom wanted to be labeled as an extremist. And so they went conservative. No one who really has been modeling and studying sea level rise, even at that time, people were screaming, that's just ludicrous to be so low. And we hope it stays so low. 44 centimeters or 39 centimeters, that sounds great. But now the sense is that if we have only 1 meter by 2100, that's great. But unfortunately, even 1 meter is increasingly looking like something that's very conservative. There's a man named Stefan Rahmstorff in Germany who does some of the best modeling. Now, once again, we don't have time machines. We can't tell you what it's going to be, so the only way you can do it is use mathematical models. But the model that Stefan has suggested is that if we have about 1.5 meters by 2100, that's probably about right. Not 2 meters, not 1 meter, someplace in between, maybe 1.25 meters. So you're looking at 4 or 5 feet at according to most of the specialists, by 2100. So this is really difficult, very difficult for the agricultural sectors, very, very difficult for infrastructure to have to deal, even with 4 to 5 feet, 1.5 meters. That's a really tough number for society to deal with.
Well, my grandchild's 5 months old, so I expect it's possible he may see those levels of new seas, and it's going to be a startling time for him to go through.